They dressed for celebration. Laughter echoed down the halls. Candles flickered against silver goblets, and the finest families in North Carolina gathered beneath the chandeliers of Gallows Hill. But no one noticed the cook. They never did. She moved through the smoke and steam like breath itself, silent, steady, unseen. And by the time they tasted her final creation, it was already too late. Because this wasn't a wedding feast. It was a reckoning. And the woman who set the table had been waiting her whole life to serve it. The first thing they did was send for the paper with the gold trim, imported from Charleston, pressed with dandelion pulp, and curled like ribbon at the edges, the kind that never reached the hands of the enslaved. They had it cut into neat rectangles, sealed each one with red wax, and the Gallows family crest an old oak tree split down the center. Invitations to a wedding, they said, a celebration of love, of legacy, of white dresses and promises made under God. But down below, in the kitchen buried beneath brick and soot, no one smiled. The enslaved were given their orders, double shifts, no rest, no complaints. They were told the bride liked figs, the groom preferred duck, and there were to be 7 courses, not including the cake. Mira stood at the far end of the room, silent, as always. She had been the plantation cook since she was 12, learning the ways of roots, salt, broth, and bone. Now she stirred without looking down, her hands moving in a rhythm older than the walls around her. When the mistress came to demand an exact menu, Mira nodded. When she slapped another girl for peeling apples too thick, Mira kept stirring. When the overseer said the governor himself would be attending, Mira's eyes didn't move. They called her simple, quiet, dull. They said she was loyal. What they didn't know was that Mira had already made her list, not of names, but of faces. Every smirk that laughed as her sister was sold, every hand that pointed when her mother was whipped, every mouth that told her she'd never be free. The guest list was perfect. Everything was falling into place. She walked the pantry with careful steps, opening jars she hadn't touched in years. Behind the flour, beneath the basket of dried peaches, she found a bundle wrapped in muslin, passed down by a woman long dead. Mira did not cry. She never had. But her hand lingered on the bundle for a moment longer than needed, as if remembering the heat of another kitchen, another fire, another betrayal. Upstairs, the bride laughed. Somewhere in the yard, a white ribbon was tied to a tree. And in the kitchen, Mira began her final preparations, not for a wedding, but for a burial, because the feast would not end with cake. It would end with silence. They said Miss Caroline's dress was imported, stitched in Paris, made of silk, spun so fine it could catch light and trap it like a spell. But those who lived behind the big house knew better. The lace hadn't crossed an ocean. It had been woven in the attic with bleeding fingers and bent backs by girls who weren't allowed to look Miss Caroline in the eye. There were 4 of them, Dinah, Ruthie, Calla, and little Beanie, who was barely 10 and already missing half a fingernail. They worked by candlelight, breathing in dust and thread, while the overseer's wife barked from the hall about hems and pearls. The needles were dull, and the blood dried fast, leaving specks like freckles on the white. They were told to pick out the stains or be whipped, but the girls had learned to hide them instead, in folds, in shadows, under seams where no white eye would look. Miss Caroline never noticed. She twirled before her mirror, arms lifted high, hair swept back, teeth gleaming like a fox. Her mother wept. The dress shimmered. It was tighter than necessary, cut to show just enough, like she wanted to be admired and feared in equal measure. My wedding is going to be the talk of the South, she whispered to her reflection, then turned and told the housemaids to fetch her lavender water. Mira watched from the doorway. She had been called up to deliver the menu for the reception, but stood silent as the girl preened. Something about the dress made Mira's hands curl, not because it was beautiful, but because it carried the weight of 100 hours stolen from children. Mira had seen those same girls fall asleep with needles still stuck in their thumbs, had hidden Beanie once in the flour bin to keep her from a whipping, and now here was Miss Caroline, radiant in a shroud built on hurt. She twirled again. Mira did not speak. She simply handed over the slip of paper listing the dishes. Duck with fig glaze, molasses bread, roasted apples, almond custard, peppered greens, pecan tarts, and blood orange cordial. Caroline barely glanced at it. "Make sure the duck skin is crisp," she said, not to Mira, but to the air, "and don't let the molasses burn this time." Then she smiled, sharp and pink-lipped, and turned her back. Mira nodded and left the room, but as she descended the narrow stairs, her hand brushed the wall, leaving behind a streak of something dark, not blood, not soot, but something from the bundle wrapped in muslin, tucked now in the folds of her apron. And behind her, in the quiet room of mirrors and lace, a thread came loose and began to unravel. The long dining table in the Gallows Hill parlor was carved from black walnut, polished to a mirror sheen, and measured precisely for 12 guests. That was the number Miss Caroline had chosen: 12 names, 12 chairs, 12 crystal goblets with etched stems that caught the candlelight just so. The table had been in the family for 3 generations, passed down like a throne, used only for holidays, funerals, and now this wedding. The servants were given strict instructions: polish the silver until it reflected faces, fold the napkins into roses, place a single white bloom at each setting. But Mira added one more: not a flower, a plate. Quietly, deliberately, before dawn broke, she slipped into the parlor with her bundle under one arm and a heavy breath in her chest. She moved like shadow, her bare feet soundless on the cold floor, and laid out a 13th place setting: spoon, fork, knife, plate, goblet, all identical to the rest. No one would notice, not at first. The guests would laugh, drink, shuffle their seats, and only later, if ever, would someone count and find the extra. By then, it would be too late. Mira chose the chair carefully, placing it near the head of the table but not at it, just off to the right. A seat for the overlooked, the forgotten, the uninvited. She unwrapped a small object from the muslin cloth and set it delicately on the plate. A bone, no longer than a finger, bleached white, wrapped in a thin red thread that wound around it 3 times, tied tight with a knot that Mira did not learn from any woman still living. She bowed her head, not in prayer, but in remembrance. Then she tucked the cloth back beneath her apron and returned to the kitchen, where the duck still needed gutting and the glaze had yet to simmer. Upstairs, the bride's laughter echoed again, shrill and weightless, like a bell rung too long. In the stables, the horses stirred, uneasy. And on the porch, the houseboy who had polished the goblets 3 times over stood squinting through the window at the table, noticing, perhaps, the 13th goblet glinting at the edge. But he said nothing. Mira did not speak to him. She did not need to. The house had already begun to shift, not in any way loud or sudden, but in the way a place inhales before the fire spreads. The table waited, dressed in its finery, unaware that its perfect symmetry had been broken. And outside, the sun finally rose, bathing the Gallows estate in gold. It was going to be a beautiful day for a wedding, but the meal had already started. Mira had been only 10, the first time they made her cook for a death. It was summer then, heavy with flies and the scent of spoiled meat, the kind of air that stuck to skin and made breathing feel like swallowing soup. A boy named Elijah had tried to run. He was fast, barefoot, and silent, just a blur past the cane fields, but not fast enough. They caught him before sundown, tied his wrists with hemp, and dragged him back through the front gate like an animal already half dead. The master said the punishment would be public. The overseer said it would be slow. But the mistress, always concerned with propriety, insisted there be a meal afterward. "Something fitting," she said. "Salt pork, cornbread, greens." A reminder. So they sent Mira to the kitchen, because her hands were small and her face didn't frighten the other children. They told her to season the pork, boil the greens, and sweeten the cornbread just enough to make it go down easier. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just did what she was told, stirring as the screams echoed through the courtyard and the white folks set out chairs to watch. When it was done, and Elijah was nothing more than a broken shape in the dust, Mira carried the food out on a silver tray. The guests were laughing. One man smeared blood from his boot with a napkin before reaching for a plate. They said the pork was tender. The greens were just bitter enough. No one asked who cooked it. No one thanked her. That night, Mira went back to the kitchen and scrubbed the pans until her fingers bled. Then she sat alone beneath the window, rocking slightly, remembering the way Elijah had smiled at her once when she stole him a peach. It wasn't until years later that she learned the old root woman in the quarters had slipped something into the salt pork. Nothing fatal. Not then. But it made every man who ate it sweat through his sheets for weeks, dreaming of fire. The woman was whipped for it, but she didn't scream. Food don't forget, she had whispered to Mira once. It remembers hands, it remembers pain, and one day it gives back. Mira never forgot that, not when they killed her sister for stealing lace, not when they branded her cousin's back with letters he couldn't read, and not now, as she stirred the glaze for the duck and watched the figs dissolve into a syrup as dark as old blood. The kitchen smelled of spice, of honey, of memory, and for the first time since she was 10, Mira allowed herself a smile, small, sharp, and meant for no one but the food itself. It was never written down, not on paper, not on bark, not in ash. Recipes like that were not meant to survive in ledgers or cookbooks. They lived in bone memory, passed mouth to ear in darkness, when the overseers slept and the night insects buzzed loud enough to hide a whisper. Mira first heard it while shelling beans beside old Sella, the woman with the scarred face and clouded eye, who they said had once fed a man a pie that made him forget his own name. "You don't poison out of anger," Sella murmured. "Anger's sloppy. Anger gets caught. But grief is patient. Grief simmers." She spoke in fragments, over years, in riddles Mira had to piece together. A root that must be boiled in silence. A powder made only from seeds that fall on the first frost. A blossom that blooms once, then never again. "You ain't making a meal," Sella would say. "You making a memory they can't spit out." Most girls didn't listen. They were too tired, too broken, or too afraid. But Mira remembered every word, even when they sold Sella off, even when the other women were forbidden to speak her name. Mira kept her voice alive in her head. The muslin bundle, small, soft, always hidden, had been passed down by hands that bled in kitchens and whispered through gritted teeth. It held the ingredients no white mouth had ever tasted, not just poison, but remembrance, because the goal wasn't to kill, not at first. It was to mark, to leave a trace inside the body, in the marrow, where screams couldn't reach. The binding ingredient was sorrow. That's why it had to be cooked slowly, without anger, without trembling. Mira stirred the sauce with a rhythm that matched her breath. In, out, in, out. The duck roasted in the oven, its skin cracking, juices pooling beneath. She added the powder last. Just enough. Not too much. Too much. Sella had warned once, and it don't punish. It pardons. Upstairs, the house swelled with laughter. Boots stomped across the floorboards. The fiddler arrived with his crooked case, and the groom's voice echoed down the stairwell like an axe against stone. But in the kitchen, it was quiet. Mira moved like a priestess. She ladled the glaze into a silver bowl, garnished the meat with rosemary, and traced one finger along the edge of the platter. Her finger came away red, not from blood, but from the thread she had tied around the bone in the 13th place setting. The recipe was complete. Not just the food, the moment, the day, the memory. She covered the platter and stepped back, her hands still steady, her face unreadable. Behind her, the fire crackled softly, unaware that it had just borne witness to something ancient, something final. The names were written in ink that smelled like iron and dried like rust. 12 guests, handpicked by Miss Caroline and her mother, each invitation sealed with wax and sent by carriage across the state. But to Mira, the list read not like a celebration, but like a death sentence, one word at a time. The judge from Raleigh, who once bought 2 brothers and returned only one, the merchant from Fayetteville, whose ledger tallied slaves by age, strength, and obedience like cattle, like coin. The reverend who baptized children in the same creek where women were drowned for tempting the master. The plantation widow with gold rings on every finger, who once sold a baby girl with eyes too light for comfort. Mira had heard their names before, whispered behind quilts, spat into the dirt, etched into the back of her thoughts, like a tally waiting to be settled. They were not just guests, they were witnesses, participants, benefactors of the pain carved into the bones of those who served the food and swept the floors and stitched the lace. Miss Caroline had called it an honor, this gathering. She wanted it to be remembered. People will talk about this for years, she'd said, holding her veil like a halo. She had no idea how right she was. Mira studied the guest list as it lay discarded in the scullery, smeared with butter and sweat. She read it twice, then once more, letting the names settle behind her eyes like weights. Each one had been fed by enslaved hands before. Each one had raised a glass while someone wept just out of sight. Now they would be fed again, but this time by choice, by intention. Not to nourish, but to mark, to reckon. Mira's hands moved without her, folding napkins, brushing crumbs, slicing fruit into careful fans. Her eyes stayed on the names. She didn't need to ask which dishes would be served to whom she already knew. The reverend liked his duck rare. The merchant refused molasses. The widow couldn't stomach pecans. The groom's uncle always asked for second helpings, and Caroline herself had a sweet tooth that ignored her corset. Mira adjusted the place settings accordingly. No one noticed the 13th seat still sat empty. No one saw the bone wrapped in red thread beneath the charger. Outside, the carriages began arriving. Hooves clattered over gravel. Parasols bloomed like flowers. Laughter poured from lace-trimmed mouths. But in the kitchen, the air grew still. The duck glistened under its final coat of glaze. The wine bottles stood like sentinels. The plates gleamed like headstones. Mira smoothed her apron and picked up the first tray. The guest list had been written in ink, but it would be remembered in blood. There was a small room off the kitchen, too narrow for more than two people to stand in, lined with nails hammered into the wall like crooked teeth. That was where they kept the aprons. Long, white, stiff with flour and smoke, each one stained by years of grease and quiet labor. No one called it anything special, but the older women whispered about it like a chapel. It was where cooks had wept after beatings, where secrets passed hand to hand beneath folded cloth, where some prayed not to be saved, but to be seen. Mira stood in the doorway that morning, with her hands still wet from washing duck fat, the muslin bundle tucked once more beneath her apron strings. The light slanted through the slats like blades, dust caught in the sun like falling ash. 11 aprons hung there, one for each woman who had fed this house and buried pieces of herself with every meal. Mira reached for her own. It was the oldest, once white, now yellowed with time, and scarred with a patch where a coal had burned through. She tied it around her waist slowly, her fingers brushing the knot that Sella taught her to tie twice around. Once under, pull tight, never let it slip. Each motion was deliberate, sacred, because today the apron was not just cloth, it was armor. Behind her, the other girls whispered about the bride's hair, the way the lace sparkled when she turned, how the guests smelled of perfume so sweet it turned the stomach. One girl giggled and was silenced with a look. Mira didn't speak. She only listened to the fabric breathe. Hanging aprons held memory. You could smell it if you stood long enough. Not just food, but sorrow, milk soured in grief, spice that covered bruises, sugar that quieted screams. Mira ran her hand across the row, fingertips grazing the ghost of each woman who'd stood where she stood now. Sella, Alma, Ruth, her mother. Each one had fed the people who hurt them. Each one had wiped their tears with the same rag used to polish silver, but none of them had ever done what Mira was about to do. She pulled a clean apron from the end of the line. Not hers. A fresh one. Pure. No blood, no burn marks, no ghosts. She tied it tight and left the old one hanging, swaying slightly, as if moved by breath. No one saw her pause at the doorway. No one heard the prayer. She whispered, not in English, not in words, but in something older. The duck was ready, the bread was rising, the plates were stacked like gravestones waiting to be laid, and Mira, now dressed in white, stepped into the fire of the day without fear, knowing the kitchen would remember this moment long after the screams had faded. The dining room pulsed with warmth and wealth, every corner glowing with candlelight, every surface gleaming with polish. Glasses clinked, silk rustled. The guests leaned back in their chairs like royalty, not realizing the floor beneath them had already begun to rot. Miss Caroline sat at the head of the table in a dress that shimmered like frost, her gloves removed, her posture poised just enough to remind everyone she had been trained for such a moment. She was not a girl, she was a spectacle, a crown of jasmine in her hair, pearls down her neck, and a hunger sharpened by praise. She reached first, before any toast was raised, before the Reverend finished his prayer, before the waitstaff could blink. The groom tried to stop her with a gentle laugh, saying something about manners, but she waved him off. "It's my wedding," she said, her voice dipped in syrup. "I get the first bite." Mira watched from the kitchen threshold as Caroline slid her knife through the duck's crisp skin, its glaze thick and dark, clinging like blood to the blade. The meat pulled apart with ease, tender, rich, hiding secrets in every bite. Mira had cooked it with care, bathing the duck in its own fat, layering the glaze in 3 coats, letting the root powder dissolve just beneath the final stir. Caroline brought the fork to her mouth, chewed, closed her eyes. A hum escaped her throat. "Perfect," she whispered. "Better than the trial run." The guest chuckled. Compliments passed around the table like wine. One by one, others followed. Slices were carved, plates filled, fingers dabbed at corners of lips. No one asked who cooked it. They never did. Mira slipped back into the shadows. She didn't need to see them eat. She had already watched them feed all her life. She returned to the kitchen and placed the ladle in the sink. It clattered louder than it should have. The fire dimmed low. The other girls were already preparing the next course: molasses bread with honey butter, the pecan tarts, the custard chilled in silver molds. But Mira stood still. She could hear the murmurs grow louder in the parlor, followed by coughs too sharp for laughter. Someone dropped a spoon. Someone else asked if the wine had been corked too long. The groom's uncle hiccuped once, then again, each sound more strained than the last. Mira wiped her hands on her apron. The bride's favorite dish had been the first to be touched. That was no accident. The duck always goes first. Just like the pain, just like the memory. Upstairs, the music stuttered. Somewhere in the yard, a dog began to howl. The Reverend rose to speak, glass raised, his voice thick with self-importance and wine. He praised the union, the wealth it promised, the lineage it protected. He spoke of God's favor, of legacy, of land passed down and blood kept pure. His words curled through the air like smoke from a dying fire. No one noticed at first that Caroline had gone quiet. Her hand still clutched the fork, a perfect curl of duck balanced at the edge, but her jaw had stopped moving. Her throat worked once, twice, then nothing. The groom turned to her with a chuckle ready, but it died before reaching his lips. Her eyes were wide. Not in pain, not yet, just confusion. A bead of sweat slipped down her temple, then another. Her hand trembled. The fork clattered to the plate. The first sound, then more, a cascade. One by one, forks dropped from fingers. Napkins crumpled. Jaws froze mid-bite. Glasses tipped, spilling wine across lace and silk. Someone gasped. The judge from Raleigh leaned forward, hand on his stomach. The merchant groaned, low in his throat. A woman in blue stood abruptly, knocking her chair over, and vomited on the polished floor. Still, the Reverend kept speaking, too lost in his own voice to see the storm rising in the room, until Caroline fell. Not dramatically, not like a swoon, just a quiet slump, her head hitting the table with a sound like soft wood splitting. The groom shouted. Chairs scraped. The fiddler stopped mid-note, and in the kitchen, Mira stood by the oven, hands still, breath even. The air had shifted. She could feel it in her chest, like a door opening inward. A girl ran past her toward the parlor. Another dropped the tray she carried, bread rolls scattering across the floor like coins at a grave. Mira didn't move. She didn't need to. The food was already working. Not like a blade, not instant, but steady, deep. It had no antidote. Because it was never meant to kill quickly. It was meant to remember. In the dining room, guests clawed at collars, eyes red, lips cracked. One man screamed at the houseboy to fetch help. Another woman collapsed into her soup, face first, arms twitching. The Reverend finally stopped speaking. His glass slipped from his hand and shattered. Mira stepped back into the pantry and closed the door behind her. She could still hear them, the muffled gasps, the thuds of bodies hitting the floor, the soft drag of silk against wood. She sat on a crate of dried beans, folded her hands, and waited. Upstairs, the chandelier swayed. The bride's veil lay like a shroud over the spilled duck. And somewhere, beneath the noise, the 13th plate remained untouched, waiting for no one. At first, they thought he was in shock. His bride had fallen, her head resting in a pool of blood-orange glaze, her corset heaving like it might crack. The guests were groaning, heaving, collapsing in pairs. And yet the groom sat frozen, his lips parted in a smile too wide, too still. It wasn't joy, it was something else, something fixed. His teeth showed, just barely. His fingers were curled around his wineglass, though it had long since emptied. Someone called his name Jonathan, but he didn't turn. His eyes stayed on Caroline, glazed over like sugar, left too long in the pan. Mira, watching from the cracked door of the scullery, knew the signs. Sella had spoken of it once, in that gravel voice that came from years of burning her throat on secrets. Some poisons lock the body from the inside, she'd said, staring into her pot. You die still smiling, but your soul's already gone. Jonathan's smile twitched at the corners, and then nothing more. His jaw stuck open, not in terror, but in that strange, awful grin that made it look like he'd agreed to all of this. The other guests hadn't noticed yet. Their own suffering was too loud, choking, retching, collapsing over spilled custard and overturned goblets. But Mira saw. The groom sat still, while chaos bloomed around him, like a statue raised to honor something wicked. The houseboy crept closer, called his name again. Sir? The boy's voice cracked. No answer. Just that smile. Mira knew what would happen next. His spine would lock. His throat would close. The last breath would come, not with a gasp, but with stillness. That was the difference between this and rage. This was not a fire that devoured. It was a silence that settled, a reckoning, the kind that made the dead look peaceful, even as the truth soured in their bellies. Someone screamed again, sharp this time. A chair crashed through the window. The widow in gold rings staggered into the hall, clawing at her mouth. Mira stepped back into the kitchen and shut the scullery door. She pressed her back to it, feeling the thud of something heavy hit the floor beyond. Then quiet. The kind of quiet only found in churches and graveyards, or kitchens, after a long day's work. Mira looked down at her hands. Steady. Clean, not a drop of blood, just flour in the creases and a faint dusting of root powder beneath one nail, the kind you couldn't taste, the kind you didn't smell, the kind that made the groom smile, like a man in love, even as his heart forgot how to beat. The first to run was the widow in gold. She kicked off her heels and stumbled barefoot through the parlor, skirts hiked in trembling fists, eyes bulging like something was already crawling inside her. She didn't scream again. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came. Her legs carried her past the fireplace, past the cracked violin, through the front door, but not down the steps. She collapsed halfway, knees folding like parchment, her body twitching as if trying to shed itself from the inside out. Behind her, two others followed, a banker's wife with perfume like lilacs, and a man with a scar that split his chin. The woman ran toward the garden gate, but the moment her feet hit the gravel, she fell forward, her hands scrabbling like a crab's in the dust. The man made it farther, nearly to the edge of the cotton field, before his breath caught mid-run, and he pitched forward into the stalks, arms splayed like a broken scarecrow. Mira didn't see it all, but she heard it. The hurried steps, the sudden stops, the thud of bodies giving up. The soil wasn't taking them. Not easily. Not yet. The poison wasn't meant to be quick. It traveled through memory, through guilt, through the tongue, and into the marrow. It gave each body a chance to flee, then reminded it there was nowhere left to go. A carriage horse screamed from the road. Something spooked it. Mira knew what. The scent. The air had changed. There was a taste to it now, thick and iron-sweet, like syrup turned sour. The house groaned in its beams, heavy with death and sugar. The chandeliers stopped swaying, everything still. One more man tried to run, an overseer, face flushed with bourbon, still clutching a tart in his fist. He staggered through the hallway toward the kitchen, saw Mira standing there, and paused. For a moment, just one, he looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Not the cook, not the shadow, a woman. Then he dropped to his knees and vomited a thread of red across the tiles. Mira stepped aside. He did not make it past her. He never touched her. None of them did. That was the truth of it. In life, they walked through her like smoke. In death, they dropped before they reached her. The ones who ran didn't get far, not because their legs failed, but because justice had been stirred into their blood like molasses. Slow, thick, irrevocable. The feast was not over, but the escape had ended. And outside, the trees stood still as witnesses. He was small enough to be overlooked, quick enough to stay out of the way, and quiet enough to hear things he wasn't meant to. They called him Little Samuel, though he was no one's child and never had been. He was the one who lit the candles, wiped the baseboards, carried water in jugs bigger than his arms, and stood behind the guests like a ghost waiting to be dismissed. But today, Samuel had not moved from his corner beside the cabinet with the broken hinge. He had seen the 13th plate before the others arrived, set with precision, the bone wrapped in red thread coiled in the center like a secret ready to speak. He had not asked about it. He knew better than to ask Mira anything when her eyes looked like they did this morning. He watched her all day, the way she stirred without blinking, the way she touched the duck like it was something already dead twice, the way her feet never made a sound. He had followed her once, years ago, through the orchard path when he couldn't sleep. She was gathering roots in silence, barefoot, humming under her breath. That hum still echoed in his dreams sometimes. He had always known she was different, not cruel, not kind, just watching, remembering, like him. So when the bride fell, when the forks clattered, and the room filled with the stench of bile and old blood, Samuel didn't run. He didn't cry. He watched. From behind the cabinet door, he saw the groom lock into his smile. He saw the banker's wife claw her own throat. He saw the reverend drop to his knees, his prayer ending mid-word, and still he did not move. Mira passed by once, her steps slow, her face calm. Their eyes met for only a moment. He didn't nod. She didn't speak. But something passed between them, not a promise, a permission. He crawled further into the dark, where no one would think to look, and waited. He could hear the house shifting. The walls seemed to breathe now. The wood no longer creaked, it exhaled. He pressed his palms to the floorboards, feeling the echoes of footfalls that would never come again. When the house finally fell silent, he stepped out. Not a scream left in him, not a tear, only the list of names he had memorized from the guest cards. He knew who had eaten, who had fallen, who had smiled. He didn't go to Mira. He didn't have to. He walked the hall instead, barefoot and careful, and picked up the 13th plate. He held it in both hands like an offering. The bone had not moved. The red thread was still tight. And somewhere in the rafters above him, something old shifted with approval. The fiddler had been playing through it all, blind to the twitching limbs and overturned chairs, bow gliding over strings like a prayer meant only for himself. He was perched in the far corner near the fireplace, teeth clenched around a sliver of pipe, eyes half shut in the trance of repetition. He had learned long ago not to stop until told music was obedience, and obedience was survival. So even as the first body slumped and silverware dropped like hail onto the linen, he kept his rhythm. The bride had requested a reel, and he played it, though the dancers never rose. His fingers bled slightly from the pressure. Still, he played until the sound changed, until the bow jerked and caught mid-glide, and the note came out warped, too sharp, too loud. It cut through the room like a scream swallowed too late. That was when he saw them, all of them, collapsed like marionettes with snapped strings, their faces stiff, their mouths parted as if still waiting to speak. Wine pooled beneath the governor's chair. A pecan tart lay crumbled beneath a gloved hand. The bride's veil had caught fire near a candle, but smoldered without flame, curling like ash paper. The fiddler rose too quickly, his chair tipped, legs catching on a fallen napkin. He stepped back and bumped into the frame of a portrait, one of the family ancestors, a man with dead eyes and a hunting rifle. The frame tilted, but did not fall. He stumbled past the body of a man he recognized, an old overseer whose boots had once kicked down the pantry door while Mira hid in the flour bin. Now the boots lay motionless, one twisted at the ankle, the other half submerged in custard. The music had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt louder than anything he had ever played. The house no longer breathed like it once did. It waited. Mira stood in the kitchen doorway, hands still, expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at him, not directly. She was looking beyond him, into a corner of the room where no one stood. He followed her gaze. There, beneath the chandelier, sat the 13th chair, empty, untouched, but the plate before it was no longer clean. A streak of glaze crossed its center. The goblet beside it, though never filled, now glistened with a faint red film. The fiddler's knees gave. He dropped to the floor, not poisoned, not wounded, just hollow, because he had played the music that carried them to the grave. Every note, every measure. And though he had eaten nothing, he understood that he, too, had been part of the feast. The last sound in the house was the final string snapping, as if the violin itself had chosen to die with the rest. Mira didn't rush. There was no need. The house had grown still, in the way a grave does settled, final, unwilling to be disturbed. She walked through the parlor without stepping over the bodies, moving instead around them, as if navigating old memories she knew by shape. The guests were silent now, slumped in their chairs or sprawled across rugs, hand-woven in foreign countries none of them had ever seen. Caroline's veil lay in the gravy boat. The Reverend's hand was still curled, as if trying to finish the blessing he never completed. Mira paused at the edge of the long table, letting her eyes drift across the aftermath. Her food had been eaten. Her work was done. Slowly, deliberately, she untied the apron from her waist. The knot came loose like a sigh. She held it in both hands, still warm with the heat of the kitchen, the threads damp where steam had kissed them. It was the new one, the white one. No blood, no oil, no smudge of soot. Still, she folded it as carefully as if it bore names. Once lengthwise, then again, corners aligned, edges pressed flat with her palm. She did not look up as she moved toward the 13th seat. It waited for her, unoccupied, untouched, but humming with something thick in the air. The plate was clean. The bone with the red thread sat exactly where she had left it. But now there was a faint ring of moisture around it, like a breath had hovered just above. Mira placed the folded apron on the charger plate like an offering, not to the dead, not to the ones who had eaten, but to those who had never been allowed to sit, the ancestors who stirred in their chains, the women who sang recipes in secret, the children taken before they had teeth to chew. The apron belonged to them now. It would stay here, in the belly of the house that had taken too much. Mira turned without ceremony. Her shoes made no sound. In the hallway, the houseboy waited with the 13th goblet in his hands. He did not speak. He only nodded once. Mira nodded back. Together, they walked to the back door, past the kitchen fire now reduced to coals, past the aprons still hanging on their nails, past the open pantry, where mice would soon reclaim their corners. She did not take anything with her. No bundle, no food, no token. Just her name, quiet in her throat, and the taste of the air behind her, sweeter than it had ever been. The wind outside had changed. The trees no longer leaned away from the house, and in the distance the sound of bells began to fade, not rung by hands, but by something older, something freed. Mira did not look back. The knock came just after dusk, soft at first, then louder, more urgent, like the sound of someone trying to wake the dead. The doctor had been summoned hours before, told there was a fainting spell at the Gallows estate, perhaps heat stroke, perhaps nerves. He had taken his time, finished his supper, cleaned his instruments, changed into a fresh coat. Miss Caroline was known for her dramatics. It wouldn't be the first time she collapsed for attention. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel as he approached the house, but no lanterns flickered in the windows. No servants met him at the steps. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if someone had meant to shut it, but lost the strength halfway through. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit first, sweet, thick, unnatural, like a bakery left to rot. Then the silence, vast and waiting. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed into the parlor. No answer. The candles had burned low. One had toppled onto the tablecloth, which had blackened around the base but refused to catch. Bodies slumped over the table, still dressed in their wedding finest, arms draped over plates, mouths parted in half-spoken words. The bride sat motionless, her head bowed as if in prayer, her gloved hands curled in her lap. The groom beside her stared with glassy eyes at a place far beyond the room. For a moment, the doctor thought he had walked into a tableau, a joke, some twisted wedding game. Then he saw the wine pooled beneath the judge's chair, the flies gathered at the edges of a tart uneaten, and the fingers of the reverend twitching in the last echoes of rigor. He dropped his bag. "My God," he whispered, "what happened here?" He moved from body to body, pressing for a pulse he never found. No wounds, no blood, just silence. Death without violence, without sound. In the hallway, a small footprint tracked Flower toward the back door. He followed it but found no one. The kitchen fire had gone out. The pantry door creaked open. The apron still hung on the nails. He turned back to the dining room, searching for the source. Something had poisoned them, but what? The food still glistened on the plates, untouched by decay. The duck looked fresh, the bread soft, the custard smooth. He reached toward a fork but stopped. His hand trembled. He saw then the 13th place setting just beyond the head of the table, too perfectly placed, too deliberately untouched. On its plate sat a folded white apron. Nothing else. No bone, no thread. Just cloth, still warm. He stepped back. The doctor had seen plagues. He had seen fever and rot. But this was different. This was chosen, a feast not meant for the living, and he, arriving after the final course, had only been invited to witness what remained. Sheriff Amos Hale had been to Gallows Hill before, once to quiet a quarrel over a boundary fence, another time to return a runaway boy, barely old enough to know his own name. But nothing prepared him for the silence that met him now. The doctor's message had been urgent, scrawled in a trembling hand. Send no one else. Just come. Alone. So he did, with his coat unbuttoned and his pistol holstered. Amos rode up the gravel drive as the last light drained from the trees. He expected noise, screaming, blood, a crime of passion or madness. But the house was quiet, too quiet, even for death. He stepped inside and the air hit him like a wall, sweet and metallic, with the sour edge of something gone wrong beneath a pretty surface. The doctor met him in the foyer, pale and mumbling, his shoes streaked with custard. "You don't want to see," he said, voice fraying. Amos saw anyway. He walked through the parlor, boots clicking softly over the blood-orange glaze that had spilled across the floor like paint. Bodies draped the furniture like forgotten puppets. The groom sat stiff in his chair, jaw locked in an unnatural grin. The bride's veil had fallen across her lap, the lace soaked in wine. Amos counted them. 12 guests, each with a plate, each with a hand outstretched, a mouth open, a story unfinished. Then he saw the 13th setting, empty, untouched, an apron folded on the plate like a signature. He didn't ask questions. He didn't write notes. He turned to the doctor and said only, "Did anyone survive?" The doctor shook his head. Amos asked nothing else. He walked out the back door, past the kitchen, where the fire had long gone cold. A small pair of footprints led to the edge of the garden and vanished. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no weapon, just a house full of the dead and a story no man would want to carry. That night, Amos sealed the property. He nailed boards across the doors and told the undertaker to leave the coffins empty. He told the town nothing, no statement, no mention in the paper. When the governor's man arrived a week later, asking about a missing judge, Amos said the carriage never came through. And when a merchant's son asked why his father hadn't returned, Amos told him the road had washed out. People stopped asking. The Gallows name was whispered less. The estate rotted under creeping vines. And Amos, who had seen what silence could do when served with ceremony, never set foot on that hill again. He locked the file. He burned the notes. And when his own son asked what had happened there, Amos just spat in the dirt and said, "Nothing worth remembering." He arrived 3 weeks later in a carriage drawn by 2 black horses and a name too heavy for the silence it entered. Elias Gallows, younger brother to the late master of the house, come to claim the land, settle the debts, and most of all, erase the stain that had spread like mold through the county's gossip. He stood at the base of the rotting steps in a clean coat and polished boots, staring up at the house that refused to crumble. The shutters hung loose. The porch sagged, and still, the air around it pulsed with something that made his skin crawl. But Elias didn't believe in curses. He believed in inheritance. He believed in keeping power clean, no matter what filth had to be swept beneath the floorboards. The sheriff didn't answer his knock. No one did. So he forced the door open and stepped inside, handkerchief pressed to his face. The smell was still there, faint but lingering, sweet rot and ash. He walked through the parlor where the long table had once stood. Now there was only a stripped room with warped floorboards and a single overturned chair. The 13th place setting was gone. But Elias saw the outline left in the dust, a square where no dust had settled, a mark that did not fade. He ordered the house boarded from the inside. He paid 2 freedmen triple wages to bury the garden, tear out the floorboards, and burn the linens. He told them nothing, just handed over a shovel and a look that said, "Don't ask." But when they tried to dig near the old vegetable patch, the soil turned black, not mud, not clay, something else. It smelled like syrup and iron. Their hands blistered. One man left before sunset and never returned. The other spat in the fire that night and muttered a prayer for the unnamed. Elias burned the remaining furniture. He doused the rugs with oil and set the parlor alight. But the fire crawled like it didn't want to spread, licking the walls without hunger. By morning, the room was scorched, but not gone. The chandelier still hung above like a witness. The staircase still creaked. Nothing collapsed. Elias boarded the windows himself, hammered the nails, drew a red X across the front door. When he turned to leave, he glanced once more through the broken glass and saw it. In the corner of the dining room, where no footprints led, where no dust had gathered, a folded white apron sat atop a plate that had not been there the day before. Elias froze, his hand on the doorknob, his breath caught. He said nothing, just stepped back into the carriage and told the driver not to stop until they reached the county line. Behind him, the house stood untouched, unwilling to be buried, and beneath its boards, the memory of the feast waited not for forgiveness, but for the next name to try and silence it. The house had been quiet for years. Trees grew wild along the fence line. Ivy crept over the porch and sank its teeth into the brick. Birds nested in the rafters where chandeliers once gleamed, and dust lay so thick inside it softened every corner like snow. No one came up the road anymore. No deliveries, no visitors, just silence, wrapped in vines. But children, as they do, don't always listen to warnings. And one boy, barefoot, curious, and too young to know the weight of ghosts, crept through the back gate one evening on a dare. His name was Isaac. He was small and fast, the kind who could slip through boards and hold his breath until the danger passed. His brother told him there was treasure in the old house, silver, maybe a jeweled comb from the dead bride's hair. Isaac didn't care about silver. He just wanted to see if the stories were true. The parlor was cold. The boards moaned beneath him, like old men talking in their sleep. He stepped lightly, eyes wide, breath shallow. The wallpaper had peeled into curls. The air was thick with a sweetness that didn't belong. Not sugar, not spice. Something deeper, something spoiled. And then he saw it. At the far end of the dining room, where the long table had once stood, there sat a single plate on the floor. Nothing else in the room was whole. Chairs broken, glass shattered, but this plate, clean, white, rimmed in silver, sat centered in a square of untouched dust. On it lay a bone, no larger than a finger, wrapped 3 times with red thread. Isaac stepped closer. He didn't touch it. He just looked. His throat went dry. He didn't know why, but he felt it in his chest like a warning pressed beneath his ribs. Behind him, the wind moved through the house in one long sigh. The plate hadn't been there when Elias Gallows left. That much was known. The sheriff had boarded the house shut, but now it sat there, waiting. And the bones, still white, still wrapped, looked newer than the dust around it. Isaac backed away, slowly, carefully. He didn't run, though he wanted to. He slipped through the door he'd entered, past the broken pantry, past the apron hooks still nailed to the wall. When he reached the road, he didn't speak. Not to his brother, not to anyone. But later that night, as the house creaked in the wind and the moon slipped behind clouds, Isaac dreamed of a woman in white, not a bride, not a ghost, just a woman standing beside a table, folding something with steady hands. When he woke, his bedsheets smelled faintly of rosemary, and he never stepped foot near Gallows Hill again. The cabin where Mira had slept was smaller than the root cellar behind the main house. It leaned slightly to the left, held up by crooked beams and stubborn memory. No chimney, no glass in the windows, just 4 wooden walls, a straw pallet, and a shelf with 3 chipped jars that once held spice but now held dust. After the wedding, no one dared open its door. The sheriff walked past it without turning his head. The doctor never stepped near it. Elias Gallows had sent a man to burn it down, but the man returned pale, stammering about something carved in the wood. No fire was set, no matches struck. The door stayed shut. But one morning, long after the house had been boarded and the fields abandoned, a traveler passed through a tinker, looking for shelter from the rain. He saw the cabin and thought it empty. The air was thick with the scent of sage and damp earth. When he reached the door, he stopped. There, etched into the wood, not with knife or chalk, but with something darker, something that sank into the grain, was a symbol. A circle, split down the center, with a fork piercing it like a stake. Not crudely drawn, precise, measured, familiar if you'd ever stood in the kitchen long enough. He didn't knock, didn't enter, just turned and left, faster than he came. Word spread slow, as it does in places with too much history and not enough names. They said the mark was a warning, or a seal, or a promise. No one agreed, but no one touched it. Over time, vines grew around the frame. The cabin sank deeper into the ground, like it wanted to disappear. Children dared each other to peek through the slats, but none got closer than a few feet before turning cold with fear they couldn't name. One boy swore he saw the door open slightly when no wind blew. Another claimed to hear humming, low, steady, like someone stirring a pot far below the earth. And the mark never faded. Rain didn't wash it away. Sun didn't bleach it. It stayed sharp, like it had just been drawn. Those who had known Mira, those who remembered her walking with quiet steps and eyes that held whole stories, never spoke of her again. Not out of hate, not even fear, but reverence, a kind of sacred silence. The kind given not to saints, but to those who had done what no one else dared. Mira's name was never written in the gallows ledger. No grave bore it, but her door remained. And so did the mark. Because even after the bodies were buried and the table cleared, The memory of what she had cooked lingered in the wood. Not poison, not vengeance, just truth, served hot and without apology. They stopped speaking of it before the season even turned. Not all at once, but gradually, like a fever breaking or a dream slipping through cracked fingers. The Gallows name was still carved into the church pew, still chiseled into the marble above the bank door, but no one said it aloud. Not the pastor, not the grocer, not the schoolteacher who once tutored Miss Caroline in French. The wedding had been meant to be the grandest event the county had seen in a decade. Every white family of importance had been invited. The table had been set for 12, but by winter, no one remembered the music. No one recalled what dress the bride had worn, or what the groom did for work, or what was served that day. The names faded fastest. The judge, the reverend, the merchant's wife. Their portraits were quietly removed from walls. Their land was passed to distant cousins. Their children, those who had not attended, were sent west, told only that their kin had met an early end. No cause given, just loss. Official records marked the deaths as unrelated. Fever, collapse, bad heart, snakebite. No dates matched. No mention of the table, or the food, or the 13th chair. It was as if the town had swallowed the truth and choked it down with sweet tea and denial. Those who remembered Mira never spoke her name again. They passed her cabin with heads bowed and voices lowered, as if the ground itself might be listening. Some said she had been an orphan. Others claimed she was born during an eclipse, that her mother died silent and her father was never named. Whatever the truth, the silence held. The house atop Gallows Hill remained sealed. Vines crept higher. The windows clouded. The wind never sounded quite right near the gate. But the children were told nothing. New ones were born, baptized, and taught to walk wide around the path leading to the estate. They never knew why. They didn't ask. One Sunday, a new preacher tried to speak the Gallows name from the pulpit. His mouth locked mid-syllable. He sat down, sweating through his collar, and never tried again. The town forgot the wedding, the way a body forgets pain after the bone heals crooked. The scar remained, but no one pointed to it. And still, on quiet nights, when the moon hung low and the trees stood still, some claimed you could smell it, the faint scent of rosemary and fig. Not strong, not foul, just enough to stir something you couldn't name, just enough to remember what you were supposed to forget. The wedding had happened, but no one in town would admit they were there, and those who survived understood that some meals never leave the tongue. They just wait for the next bite. They say, if you stand at the edge of the tree line just before dusk, when the air turns copper and the wind forgets how to move, you can still see it through the highest window of the Gallows house, the white apron, hanging alone on the nail above the hearth. The boards are nailed shut, the glass is long gone, but the window remains intact, as if time itself refused to touch that single square of sky. No one climbs the hill anymore, not even the desperate. Vagrants who once tried to sleep inside never made it through the night. One man stumbled into town barefoot at sunrise, eyes glazed, mumbling about the smell of roasted duck, and a woman humming in a voice too deep for any throat. He never spoke again, and yet the apron remains. It has not yellowed, it has not fallen. It hangs like a flag, no longer of surrender, but of warning. Some say it was never truly cloth, that it was folded from something else entirely, something left behind by a hand that never forgot how to serve but refused to be silenced. The children whisper about it in games they don't understand. They call it the widow's bib. They dare each other to look through the telescope kept in the old schoolhouse and swear they've seen it sway when no wind blew. One girl, bold and too young to know better, claimed she saw a hand reach for it once, thin, dark, graceful. The next day she refused to eat, said her food tasted like dirt and fig skin. Moved away within the month. The town pretends the house is nothing, a ruin, a relic. But no one dares paint over the boundary stone at the foot of the hill. The sheriff's grandson once tried, and his brush split in half. No one tried again. The apron remains. Mira's mark, they call it. Some believe she died that day, swallowed by the very house she condemned. Others think she walks still, moving from kitchen to kitchen, stirring pots in places where wrong has simmered too long. But the apron does not fade, and those who've cleaned blood know this. Cloth forgets nothing. It holds what it's given: salt, grease, spit, hope, even justice. And there, in that untouched window, it hangs not by chance, not by habit, but by will. A woman's will. A cook's. One who fed the masters until she fed them truth. The kind that stains deeper than wine. The kind that does not wash away. The kind that waits in silence. Above the dining room floor, fluttering slightly in a house that still remembers every name spoken over its last meal. No last name, no birth record, no ledger entry that survived the years. Just Mira, a single name spoken in fragments, carried by wind and caution. The elders whispered it only when the sun was down and the children were asleep, and even then, never too close to the fire. Because names hold weight. Names wake things. And Mira's name, though stripped from every book and denied from every registry, was heavier than most. Not because it was rare, but because it had been earned. She had been born in the shadows of a kitchen, or so they guessed, her first breath likely soaked in steam and salt. Her mother's name was gone, her father's never known. She was raised by women whose names were also forgotten, whose recipes lived only in their fingers. And yet, Mira remained. A cook, a servant, a silence, until she wasn't. When the gallows wedding was first planned, her name appeared once scribbled in chalk on a back wall as part of the kitchen rota. Mira, Duck. That was all. No title, no instruction, just a name beside a dish, like an offering left at the edge of a grave. After the feast, after the bodies were counted and the doors were nailed shut, no one dared speak her name aloud in public. To do so was to court memory, and memory had teeth. The judge's widow, who survived only by virtue of illness that kept her home that day, was said to flinch at the sound of boiling water. She never said the cook's name again. The sheriff refused to write it in his final report. The preacher who baptized the Gallows children scratched her name from the church rolls and claimed she'd never existed, but the name lingered anyway. In root cellars, in prayer, in the corners of the town that would not forget, even when told to. Mira, not a ghost, not a myth. A woman with calloused hands, steady eyes, and a silence sharp enough to cut through linen and bone. Children born after the wedding learned it in pieces. They drew it into the dirt, sang it into jump rope songs. Mira, Mira, stir the stew, tell me what they did to you. Teachers scolded them. Mothers hushed them. But the song stayed. Her name never grew, never changed, never softened. It stayed small and sharp, like a knife left out in the rain. In the years that followed, other cooks came and went. Other meals were served. But none stayed long near Gallows Hill. The kitchen remained cold. The hearth never caught fire, and the hooks on the wall once lined with aprons stood empty. Except for one. Because though Mira's name may never have filled a census, it filled the house, in the walls, in the dust, in the silence that followed every meal, not forgotten, just unspoken. They broke through the boards on a dare. Teenagers, not from the town but passing through, half drunk on ghost stories and the thrill of trespassing. The gallows house had stood untouched for decades, slouched into its own rot like a secret too tired to keep itself. But the vines hadn't covered the parlor door. The wood had warped, but the frame still held, and when the first boy kicked it open, laughing, the wind rushed out like breath held too long. Inside, the house was colder than it should have been. Not the cold of time, but the cold of something watching. Dust coated every surface except the table, the long table, still standing in the center of the room, laid out with 12 settings, silverware polished, napkins folded, crystal goblets glinting in the dark. The food remained, duck glistening beneath a hardened glaze, bread curled but whole, custard still trembling in silver cups. Not a fly, not a speck of mold. It hadn't rotted. One girl leaned in to touch the tart, but the moment her fingers neared it, the chandelier above creaked once and dropped a single bead of wax onto her wrist. She yelped, The wax was warm. They laughed it off, but no one touched the food again. At the head of the table sat a folded white apron, and at the 13th seat, though no plate had been placed, no guest named, lay a bone, wrapped in red thread, still tight, still bright, as if tied only hours ago. One boy muttered that the house must be staged, preserved by some historical group, but his voice didn't carry far. The air swallowed it. They left without taking photos, without pocketing silver, without speaking Mira's name. Outside, the trees leaned away from the hill, and from the highest window, the apron still hung. What they didn't see was this. As the door swung shut behind them, the chandelier swayed, and one of the goblets filled slightly with something red. Thick, warm, waiting. The feast had not spoiled because it had not finished. It waited for memory to return, for hunger to find its way back, for another bite to be taken, because justice, when slow-cooked and served without apology, does not spoil. It simmers, it watches, and it endures. Beneath Gallows Hill, the earth had taken the bodies, but the house kept the table, a shrine to silence, a shrine to truth, a shrine to the woman who fed the South its own sins, one bite at a time. If this story whispered something cold into your bones, comment the oldest town in your country. And if you want more stories that linger long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.